Hello, everyone. The old church stood in the middle of a small village, surrounded by towering ancient trees that seemed to serve as loyal guardians. The building was not only a center of worship, but also a relic filled with mystery. The villagers often whispered about strange sounds coming from inside the church at night. Footsteps, faint whispers, and the sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor. However, no one dared to investigate further, except for one person, Pastor Andreas. Andreas was known as a devout, dedicated, and courageous man. He had served in the church for over 2 decades, believing he had been chosen to safeguard the place. Yet something had always disturbed him. Behind the grandeur of the main altar, Andreas felt there was something hidden, something untold in the church's history. One night, as the village slept under a moonless dark sky, Andreas decided to investigate on his own. He brought a large candle, a hammer, and an old chisel. With unwavering determination, he began tapping on the stone floor behind the altar, trying to locate the source of the strange vibrations he often felt while praying there. The hammer's blows echoed in the night's silence, making Andreas feel as if something in the shadows was watching him. After hours of work, he finally uncovered a small crack covered in thick dust. The crack was invisible to the untrained eye, but Andreas was certain there was something beneath it. As he cleared the crack, a sudden cold draft blew from under the floor, causing his candle flame to flicker wildly. A chill ran down Andreas' spine, but he didn't back away. Carefully, he began prying up the surrounding stones until an old wooden door slowly came into view. The door was tightly sealed, with a faded cross carved in the middle. Its ironwork was rusted but still sturdy. When Andreas touched the door, an eerie sound like a long sigh emanated from below, making him pause. "Who's there?" Andreas asked, his voice trembling, though he knew no reply would come. Taking a deep breath, he gripped the iron handle and twisted it with all his strength. A loud creak filled the room as the door opened, revealing a spiraling stone staircase leading downward into impenetrable darkness. A damp, earthy smell rose up, making Andreas cough. He relit his candle and began descending the steps cautiously. Each step felt like entering a different world, a world that had been locked away for centuries. At the bottom of the stairs, he found a small, dark, and dusty room. In the center of the room stood 2 large wooden chests, tightly sealed. Andreas felt a cold presence unlike anything before, as if something alive was lurking in the darkness, watching him. His candle flickered, threatening to go out, but he pressed on. As he touched one of the chests, faint footsteps echoed from the top of the stairs, freezing him in place. Yet he chose to ignore the sound. With trembling hands, he opened the first chest. What he saw made him stagger back, his breath caught. The body of a man, wrapped in white cloth, lay perfectly preserved, as if freshly buried. Next to the corpse was a piece of cloth inscribed with strange writing he couldn't understand, letters that seemed alive. Andreas tried to calm himself and open the second chest. Inside, there were only dry, crumbling bones. A small cross lay beside the bones, faintly shining despite the dust-filled room. He stood between the 2 chests, confused and fearful. How could the body in the first chest remain intact while the second one was reduced to bones? And why did a sudden coldness pierce his skin, as though something or someone was watching him from the darkness? Before Andreas could fully process what he had found, his candle suddenly went out, leaving him in complete darkness. In the chilling silence, a soft whisper, almost like a prayer, echoed in a language he didn't understand. The whispers came from all directions, filling the small room. "Is this a test, Lord?" Andreas muttered, his body trembling. Yet, deep down, he knew that this night marked the beginning of something far greater than he had ever imagined. That night seemed endless for Andreas. The darkness in the church's basement didn't just envelop his body, but also pressed upon his soul. The strange whispers continued to reverberate in his ears, like prayers spoken with urgency. Andreas tried to steady himself, but the fear and curiosity kept him rooted between the two large wooden chests. With trembling hands, he fumbled in his robe's pocket for a match to relight his candle. When the candlelight finally flared up again, dark shadows on the walls began to move wildly, as though an unseen creature was lurking around him. Andreas directed the candlelight back toward the first chest, where the intact body still lay. The white cloth wrapped around it appeared clean, as if untouched by time. He stared at the cloth with the strange writing near the body. The writing seemed to emit an aura that was difficult to describe. Not light, but its presence felt incredibly real. His curiosity overcame his fear. Andreas carefully took the cloth and brought it closer to the candlelight. The writing appeared to be in an ancient language he had never seen before. The letters curved beautifully, and for some reason, he felt there was something sacred about the writing. Yet at the same time, he also sensed that the writing contained a great secret, something trying to communicate with him. As Andreas held the cloth, he suddenly heard heavy footsteps from above the stairs, as though someone was descending slowly. His heart raced. He looked toward the stairs, but all he saw was darkness. "Andreas!" A deep, heavy voice called his name. Andreas froze, his candle nearly falling from his hand. He tried to answer, but his voice got caught in his throat. "Andreas!" The voice called again, now much closer. "Who's there?" Andreas finally shouted, his voice echoing through the basement. But there was no answer, only silence in response. Andreas tried to gather his strength and looked at the second chest, where the almost decayed bones lay. The small cross inside the chest now seemed to glow faintly, as though ignited from within. He approached the chest, sensing something unusual. When he touched the edge of the chest, the whispering sound returned, clearer this time. What shocked Andreas was that he began to understand the meaning of the whispers. The first is the messenger, the second is the lost. Andreas froze. The words sounded like a judgment, but he couldn't grasp their meaning. Who was the messenger? And what did it mean to be lost? Suddenly, the candle in his hand went out again, plunging the room into darkness. But this time, Andreas felt that the darkness was not just physical. It was as if he was surrounded by the presence of something unseen, something large and powerful. In that darkness, he heard footsteps quickly moving toward him. He tried to back away, but the steps stopped right in front of him. A cold chill enveloped his body, making it hard for him to breathe. Then, a whisper sounded directly in his ear, so clear it made his whole body tremble. "Find the truth, Andreas, before your time runs out." At that moment, the candle in Andreas' hand reignited by itself. He gasped, cold sweat dripping down his face. There was nothing in front of him, but he knew the voice was real. With trembling hands, he stepped toward the stairs and left the basement, clutching the cloth with the strange writing he had found. He hastily shut the wooden door and made sure the crack was sealed tight, as if trying to lock something inside. However, Andreas knew that whatever had happened that night, he couldn't ignore it. The writing on the cloth was calling to him, as if it were trying to whisper answers that had long been hidden. That night, as he sat in his small room beside the altar, Andreas couldn't sleep. Outside the church, the wind howled, carrying faint voices that seemed to call his name. For him, the door he had opened was not just a gateway to the basement. but also a door to a mystery that would change his life forever. The gray morning enveloped the small village, but Andreas felt that the night still lingered in his mind. He sat in his study, staring at the cloth with the strange writing that he had brought from the basement. Although he didn't understand it, the writing seemed to speak directly to his soul, evoking both curiosity and fear. Andreas knew he couldn't ignore what he had seen. The two bodies in such contrasting conditions, the voices calling, and the whispers hinting at something about the truth. All of it was a puzzle he couldn't ignore. He decided to visit a scholar in the neighboring village, a man named Ibrahim, who was known as an expert in ancient languages. Ibrahim, though a Muslim, often helped anyone who needed knowledge about old manuscripts. Clutching the cloth tightly in his hand, Andreas walked across the village, which was starting to stir under the pale sunlight. The villagers glanced at him with curiosity. Andreas rarely left the church, let alone with a determined expression on his face like that morning. When he arrived at Ibrahim's house, Andreas told him part of what he had found, avoiding details about the chests and bodies to keep the church's secrets. He simply showed Ibrahim the cloth and asked him to translate it. Ibrahim took the cloth carefully and studied it with a serious gaze. "This is a phrase in Arabic," he said after a moment. "It reads, La ilaha illallah, Mohammedur Rasulullah." Andreas frowned. "What does it mean?" he asked. Ibrahim smiled faintly. "It means, there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is the messenger of Allah. This is the Shahada, the core of a Muslim's faith." Hearing this, Andreas fell silent. The phrase, so simple yet so powerful, seemed to stir something within him. He tried to hide his confusion, but Ibrahim noticed the change in his expression. "You seem shaken," Ibrahim said quietly. "Is there something you'd like to share?" Andreas quickly shook his head. "Just curiosity," he said, trying to sound casual. "I found this cloth in an unexpected place. I just wanted to know what it meant." But Ibrahim didn't press him further. Instead, he began explaining the phrase. He explained that for a Muslim, the Shahada is a declaration of faith, the gateway to Islam, and a pledge to the absolute truth of the oneness of God. This explanation made Andreas increasingly uneasy. He had never imagined being involved with anything related to another religion, let alone Islam, which he had only ever heard of in skeptical whispers from his own community. Yet, something intrigued him. Not just Ibrahim's words, but the sense of peace that slowly crept into him as he listened. When he returned to the church, Andreas sat on a long bench near the altar. He gazed at the floor where he had discovered the secret door the night before. His thoughts spun endlessly. Why was there Arabic writing on the chest? Why did the body in the chest remain intact? And what did the whispers about the messenger and the lost mean? He decided to open the Bible and try to find answers within it. But each page he read only added to his confusion. Ibrahim's words about the oneness of God continued to echo in his ears, like a reverberation that wouldn't fade. That night, when the church grew quiet again, Andreas decided to return to the basement. There was something there, a truth he felt he needed to uncover. With a candle in hand, he opened the wooden door once more and descended the same staircase, this time with less fear but more determination. When he reached the basement, the air felt colder than before. The two chests still stood in their place, like loyal sentinels. Andreas approached the first chest where the intact body lay. He stared at the face covered by the cloth and felt something strange. Not fear, but respect. Andreas stood there, trembling with a mix of awe and fear. The light had vanished, but its presence lingered in the room, as if it had left an imprint on his soul. The whispers that had once filled him with dread now seemed like distant echoes of something far greater than himself, something divine. He glanced at the two chests, one holding the body of the messenger and the other the remains of the lost. In that moment, he realized that these were not just two separate stories, but two paths. One was the path of light, the other darkness. But which path would he choose? His heart felt heavy as he pondered the choices before him. The voice had spoken of light, of guidance, of truth, but it had also whispered of those who strayed from that light, who chose their own way. Andreas felt an overwhelming sense of responsibility, as though the decision he was about to make would affect not only his own fate but the fate of others as well. As he stood there, the weight of the moment pressing down on him, Andreas understood that this was more than just a search for knowledge. It was a search for redemption. He had been given a glimpse of something greater, something beyond the confines of his beliefs, and now he had to confront the reality of that truth. The air in the basement grew still again, and for a long moment, Andreas simply stared at the two chests. He felt the pulse of his own heartbeat, steady yet uncertain. He knew that whatever he chose, it would be a path of profound change. His entire life, his faith, everything he had built his identity upon, would be questioned and possibly reshaped forever. Finally, with resolve slowly taking root in his heart, Andreas stepped closer to the first chest, the one that held the body of the messenger. There was something about it, something that called to him. It was as though the very essence of what lay within this chest offered him a key to unlock the mysteries of his own soul. He reached out and lifted the cloth that covered the face of the body. As the cloth fell away, a wave of light seemed to fill the room, not from any physical source, but from deep within the chest itself. The face of the body was serene, peaceful, as if it had been waiting for this moment. Andreas' breath caught in his throat. The face was not unfamiliar. It was the face of someone he had known long ago, a face he had not seen in years. The figure before him was not just a messenger, but someone who had touched his life in a way he could never have expected. A flood of memories rushed through his mind. He remembered the teachings, the lessons, the deep connection he had once felt to this person. The truth he had sought was not external, but within him all along. The light was not something he could find in ancient texts or cryptic messages. It was within his heart, within his very being. As the realization dawned on him, Andreas felt a profound peace settle over him. He understood now. The truth was not something to be feared, nor was it something that could be understood in its entirety by the mind alone. It was something that transcended understanding, something that could only be felt, lived, and embraced. With newfound clarity, Andreas gently closed the chest, the light of understanding still glowing softly within him. He turned toward the second chest, the one that held the remains of the lost. This chest, too, held its own lessons, its own truth. But for now, Andreas knew that the path he had chosen was one of illumination, one of faith in the light that guides the lost back to the truth. And so, with a heart full of purpose, Andreas left the basement. He had found what he had been searching for, not in the mysteries of the past, but in the deep truths of the present, in the light that had always been with him. And as he ascended the stairs, leaving the darkness behind, he felt the weight of his journey lift from his shoulders, replaced by a sense of peace and resolve. The door to the basement closed softly behind him, and for the first time in his life, Andreas knew that he was not alone. Andreas stepped out of the church with a newfound sense of clarity. The heavy burden that had weighed on him for so long had lifted, replaced by a quiet but unwavering resolve. He had uncovered the truth, not through the rigid teachings of his past, but through the profound and unexpected journey he had undertaken. The whispers, the symbols, the ancient texts, it all led him here, to a place of peace and understanding. The morning sun bathed the village in golden light, casting long shadows on the cobbled streets. Andreas walked toward the village with steady steps, his heart lighter than it had ever been. There was no more doubt in his mind, no more fear. He had found the light, and now he knew that his purpose was to share it, to guide others who might be lost, just as he had once been. As he passed the familiar homes of his neighbors, they looked at him with curiosity. His journey had changed him. His eyes, once clouded with confusion, now shone with a quiet wisdom. Andreas knew that he would have to explain his transformation, but he was ready. He had embraced a truth that transcended all the divisions and labels he had once known. It was not about religion, not about old dogmas, but about seeking the light that united all humanity, regardless of belief or background. He continued down the path, thoughts of the journey still swirling in his mind. The visions of the two figures, the one standing tall in the light and the other bowed in sorrow, remained vivid in his heart. He understood now that those who embraced the light would find peace, while those who turned away from it would forever remain in darkness. It was a truth that transcended all human constructs. Andreas made his way to the center of the village, where the small community gathered each day. As he walked, he could feel the eyes of the people upon him. But this time it didn't matter. He had no fear of their judgment, for he knew that he had found something far greater than their approval. His path had been set, and he would walk it with courage. When he reached the village square, Andreas paused. He turned to face the people who had once seen him only as the preacher of their church. He opened his mouth to speak, not knowing exactly what he would say, but trusting that the words would come. "The truth I once believed," he began, his voice steady and clear, "was not the only truth. I have found something more, something that transcends everything I knew before. There is only one light, and that light belongs to all of us." The crowd stood in silence, watching him intently. Andreas felt the weight of their gaze, but he did not falter. "I have discovered the path that leads to peace, to salvation," he continued, his heart swelling with the conviction of his words. "It is not a path defined by religion or belief, but by the light that shines within all of us. I invite you to seek that light with me, to walk together on this journey of truth." The villagers exchanged looks, some curious, others skeptical, but none of them spoke. Andreas could feel the tension in the air, but he was not afraid. He had found his own peace, and that was enough. He left them with one final thought: the light is here. It has always been here. All we need to do is open our hearts to it. With that, Andreas turned and walked away, his steps light and sure. His journey had only just begun, but he no longer walked alone. He had found the truth he had long sought, and now it was his turn to share it with the world. The light, the guidance, the peace. It was his responsibility to carry it forward, wherever it might lead. And as he walked into the distance, the sun rose higher, casting its warm glow on the path before him.